I'm going to kick this off by telling you a couple of historical references. In 1779, the pioneering naturalist William Bartram published his book about his travels throughout, among other places, Florida, and it inspired Samuel Taylor Coleridge to write Kubla Khan. It inspired him in his writing of that. Well, actually, I guess drugs inspired him more than Bartram did, but inspired him to write about the caverns measureless to man. In 1867, another tourist, a guy named John Muir, made his 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf. He got to Cedar Key and was bitten by a mosquito that gave him malaria and felled him and prevented him from going on to Cuba as he'd planned. But while he was there, while he was recovering, it occurred to him that maybe, just maybe, there were things in nature that existed for nature and not to serve man, which is a pretty remarkable insight to have when you have a high fever.
and this is before he went to the West Coast and became the long-bearded mountain man and the founder of American conservation that we know.
Yes, exactly.
And
So
I'm going to quickly
Inspired by Florida.
yeah.
point out that William Bartram, who was a great naturalist and a beautiful writer and spoke of Florida in the most flattering terms as a beautiful apartment in the palace of the sovereign creator, which is damned flattering. He did not write about mosquitoes. He was in the St. John's country, and I know he got bit, but he didn't cop to it. So I've always been a little suspicious of Brother Bartram.
So I just wanted to mention that Florida, right from the beginning, was influencing literature and influencing the way people viewed the environment. Lest you think Cedar Key was some wonderful environment for that sort of thing, in 1890, the mayor of Cedar Key hired a thug as his town marshal and turned it into an island dictatorship. The New York Times actually described him as a bulldozer from way back, and for no other reason than a pure cussedness. So he would fit in quite well with our current crop of legislators. Anyway, a woman on Cedar Key wrote to President Benjamin Harrison and said, "You've got to help us. We're under a reign of terror." And about that time, the mayor and his town marshal assaulted the customs keeper there, who was a federal employee. And so President Harrison sent a Navy cutter to invade Cedar Key and arrest the mayor. So I fully expect that woman to be the hero of Lauren Groff's next book, but that's just me.
So let me add just one thing about Bartram. Bartram's book, which is very important to restoration ecologists or scientists in Florida, by the way, because of what he described, in North Florida at least. A lot of the South Floridians don't know about Bartram. But he was the premier botanist naturalist or one of the premier botanists and naturalists of the late colonial period and the early republic. And his book bombed in the United States. It was a bestseller abroad. It immediately went into 9 languages and multiple printings. But Americans thought his descriptions of Florida were fanciful, that he was not writing about biology, but he was writing fiction. But again, it's a very important book and inspiring to so many people today.
He needed to insert the Dave Barry line. I swear I'm not making this up.
He what?
He needed to insert the Dave Barry line. I swear I'm not making this up.
Yeah, he should have. But Muir was a beautiful writer himself. Both Bartram and Muir, they were both naturalists. Muir, in fact, described the group of cedar-clad islands around Cedar Key as arranged like a tasteful bouquet and placed in the sea to be kept fresh. And then 8 years later, a wonderful poet from Georgia by the name of Sidney Lanier also came to Florida, North Florida, to write a travel guide. And he ended up in Cedar Key, and he fell in love with the natural place. He had mixed words to say about the people who lived there and some of the structures. But he described Cedar Key as a vast, sweet visage of space. And now you have to understand, in these, and both Muir also said of nature that nature possessed immortal beauty. And naturalists, men, women of science in those days, didn't have an ecological understanding of the world. They didn't understand the interconnectedness of life like we do today. So much of their observation was grounded in beauty, and that's what moved many of these people. And it was Florida beauty that began bringing people from the Northeast, from the Midwest, from the British Isles to Florida soon after the Civil War in the 1870s. They were our original tourists, and our original tourist trade was not the beaches. People didn't go to the beaches. It was interior Florida and the natural specimens there, the flora and the fauna, both beautiful and exotic. So Florida's original tourism was ecotourism. And it was largely writers that were responsible for the launching of this tourist industry in Florida, because famous writers, Henry James, Stephen Crane, Ralph Waldo Emerson, they came to Florida, they wrote about Florida, and people got word of it, and famous painters of the time came down here as well. And one of the most famous and most memorable visitors to Florida, who became, as Diane will tell you, probably our first snowbird, was Harriet Beecher Stowe.
You know, I think it's not generally known, historians know it, but that Harriet Beecher Stowe, after the Civil War, what does she do? She moves to the Old South. She moves to Mandarin on the St. Johns River. And she became a cheerleader for Florida tourism, writing about the balmy breezes and the beautiful rivers. She loved the Silver River. She wrote scathingly of the terrible trade in egrets. People shot egrets, killed egrets, made them close to extinct because women wore egret feathers in their hats. That was fashionable. So there she is. She also, remember, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, which did not start the Great War. Lincoln didn't say that. But she wrote about slavery in a way that galvanized opinion, abolitionist opinion, especially amongst women. She was writing for women. So she comes down to Florida and then writes as well about how lovely it is. You know, there being loads and loads of formerly enslaved people, but you could hire them for cheap, and they were so delightful. So, you know, Henry James was very rude about Florida, as was Emerson in many places. I mean, people could both love it and hate it. Henry James was very snotty about Flagler's big fancy hotel, the Breakers. Yeah. So that's quite a hoot.
But he was ironically foolish about the St. Johns River.
Yes, yes. Well, you know, people see that and they do go a bit squidgy, don't they?
Well, one of the things I enjoyed about listening to Gilbert was it was a strong reminder that the environment of a place goes beyond the flora and the fauna and the weather to include the customs, the people who live there, the politics, the political currents, the what's going on. And boy, as Gilbert suggested, every day of the year, there's a story on the front page of any newspaper in the state that merits dealing with, either as a piece of nonfiction or as a novel. I mean, think about it. Can you imagine somebody being introduced as the noted Missouri writer? Nobody really, I don't think, aspires to that, but the noted Florida writer carries some cachet because Florida has come, what goes on here has come to be important around the world. People want to know, they want to hear about it because they know that that a lot is going on down here, not only historically but presently. The world has changed, of course, particularly in South Florida because of the wave of immigration from South America and the Caribbean. It's an amazing place to be on all fronts. Not just a lot of people come to live here because it's pretty, and who doesn't want to hang out on the beach? But in terms of storytelling, there's a lot going on here that goes beyond just environmental issues.
And Florida is as much an idea as it is a place. We have constructed a Florida, or actually we constructed a lot of Floridas. And a case in point is the habit of planting palm trees in a place, palm trees. Florida is big. I'm from Tallahassee. It is very cold there right now. It always gets very cold in January, not permanently, but it gets cold. We plant palm trees because that looks like Florida. And somehow live oaks, which are our major native tree, doesn't look like Florida. So we're constructing this imaginary place. Jeff Vandermeer talked about, who gets to imagine what. And most of our developers and our politicians have been on a mission to imagine this so-called paradise. Paradise sells, and history is alarming. So we prefer paradise. The beach has no history, we think, and yet we are haunted by just the things Gilbert was talking about. We are haunted by things far, far in the past. And whenever my students, who come from much more urban Florida than I do, say, well, everything here is new. I make them go to the Lake Jackson mounds, which were built, at least begun to be built at about the same time as Chartres Cathedral in France. And they're of the same import, I would have said, just very different worldview. We're old and we're haunted, as well as new, shiny, and beachy.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it Ralph Waldo Emerson who went to Tallahassee and found it to be full of...
Oh, he hated it. Prostitutes.
St. Augustine.
Oh, he hated Tallahassee too.
Really?
It was full of prostitutes, and he didn't say grifters, but he meant grifters. Tallahassee was home to a lot of Euro trash. Seriously. We had Napoleon's nephew, who was a very dubious person, Prince Hakim Murat, who was on the make for a nice marriage. And he married George Washington's great niece. He thought she had money. She thought, since he was a prince, he had money. They had no money. He had a plantation. He had children with his slaves, And he used to walk around with a St. Bernard at his side, which he used as a spittoon. He was a seriously disgusting person. And she was so happy, his wife, when he died, because she got a stipend from the French government as a princess of France. And so she swanned around being a princess while, he was dead, had venereal diseases, among other things. So, yeah, the Bonapartes, man.
So the interesting people you meet in Florida have inspired a lot of writers, especially crime writers. You'll find, basically an awful lot of Florida literature is the literature of crime. Am I not right about that?
I think so. I think that, it's just after the turn into the 21st century that literary Florida is really being, is opening up. You've got writers like Karen Russell and Lauren Groff who are exploring territory that really never was dealt with before. Maybe Peter Matheson, Killing Mr. Watson, maybe Patrick Smith, The Land Remembered, but it's hard to think about the big Florida book. I'm not sure it's been written yet, still waiting out there. But the litany of crime writers who noted nationally and internationally known crime writers who flourished in Florida, beginning with, of course, John D. MacDonald and somebody you and I might want to talk about a little bit later, Charles Willeford, as well as Carl Hyacin, and many others.
Now, of course, I find MacDonald inspiring, and I think MacDonald is the perfect example for this panel because a lot of what he wrote was crime, but also environment, and a lot of it was targeted as what he called the fast buck artists who were trying to pave Florida. That was, as a kid growing up in Pensacola, reading those books, it was my first introduction to the idea that A, this was a sunny place full of shady people, and B, that there were people who did not appreciate Florida's natural bounty the way I did, that they were actually trying to get rid of it, and then I found out my dad was part of it. So that, that was a nice connection. But
books like Condominium, Flash of Green,
Yes.
Outside the Travis McGee series.
yeah, and even the Travis McGee series as well, because a lot of his
Yep.
bad guys were developers or were people in the development industry too.
He's
So,
attacking developers in his 1950s books,
Yeah.
particularly Dredge and Fill developers.
Dead Low Tide.
Dead Low Tide,
Yeah,
yeah.
and Flash of Green, which came out in 1962, same time as Silent Spring, and is about an environmental issue.
And it's regarded as the first environmental novel.
Yeah.
Or ecological novel is the word.
Exactly.
That's used, yeah.
Plus, they're good reads.
They're very good reads.
Yeah.
Well, and Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, you could say, had a great attention to climate because she writes about a very, very big and nasty hurricane in the muck farms, as they were called, of South Florida. And I think if there is something pushing to be the great Florida novel, that might be in the top 5.
Absolutely.
That's the most astonishing book that could only have been written in Florida because Eatonville was a really special place. That was it was black people not living in a white context. They lived in a town they ran, they controlled, they had the culture, they had the churches, they had the city office. And Zora Neale Hurston was brought up in that place. So her context wasn't, the horrors of Jim Crow, though she, of course, wrote about that since the heroine's mother, product of a rape, she was. And that's why Janie is such a compelling character, because she's considered enough white to be terribly desirable by everybody. But that novel put a Florida on the map that no one knew. And it's the most extraordinary novel. I know y'all have all read it, but it's extraordinary.
There are 2 novels you would not want to read at the start of hurricane season. One is Their Eyes Were Watching God, and the whole Monstropolis Beast issue, and then Condominium by John D. MacDonald. Those are both very frightening.
Just about the time that Hurston's book came out, I wanted to mention that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who best known for River of Grass, the magnificent book about the Everglades, nonfiction, she cut her chops. She was a reporter for the Miami Herald at the time. She cut her chops as a mystery writer for the pulps. Her first publication was a mystery story published in 1925 in the Saturday Evening Post. And she followed that up with a dozen or more. Man, you can make money at this, she told her dad.
Yeah, she wrote nearly 50 short stories for the magazines, and the majority of them were set in South Florida,
Yeah.
and Everglades as well. And I want to make a case for her book, The Everglades River of Grass, as the Florida nonfiction book. Most people, I think, don't read beyond her first very famous, probably most quoted first line, and that is, "There are no other Everglades in the world." But if you read into that book, it's beautifully written. She tells the history of Florida, and it is extraordinary. She's writing in the 1940s. She treats native peoples, the indigenous people of Florida, as historical agents, not as objects who were acted upon by whites. She treats them as individuals who had some control of their own life. And this was a time when anthropologists weren't even doing that, when anthropologists were still treating native peoples as bronze-skinned, semi-humans. And this is also an ecological book. Ecological science is not an accepted field in Eastern universities yet in the 1940s. And she's writing about the ecology of the interconnectedness of life of the Everglades, and it's extraordinary. It was one of 60 some odd books in the Rivers of America series, and her book goes deeper into nature. And the Rivers of America series was supposed to focus on the nature and the culture of a particular river. And typically the other books would devote maybe 4 or 5 pages to nature and then leave it behind. but Douglas sticks with it, and it is really an extraordinary environmental history and a human history of Florida.
Sure.
I think if y'all were around in Florida in 2000, even if you weren't, you know that the year 2000 was a very important one for us, where, you know, there'd been all these Floridas, all these sort of iterations of Florida. Florida as a Jim Crow state, Florida as paradise, Florida as land boom, not necessarily in that order. In 2000, people were forced to take Florida seriously as a political system, which I think has inspired lots and lots and lots of nonfiction books. And I just remember my mother saying, "Oh my God, they've all finally learned to spell Tallahassee." You know, and it was so much fun to be around during that. And, you know, we kind of tried to sublimate that it was a constitutional crisis, you know, the first now of many. You know, we should get used to them. But it was amazing. You know, and all of these people were walking around asking questions, reporters from the Northeast, from the big fancy papers and the BBC and the Agence France Presse and the whole thing, saying things like, "What do you call that?" And I'd say, "We call it camellia." You know, they didn't know the flora, they didn't know the fauna. They thought that alligators might be in their hotel rooms. You know, they'd climb in the window and raid the minibar. It was a hoot. I had no idea, having been born in Tallahassee into a very, very inert Florida family that never went anywhere, that we could be considered exotic in this way or fascinating. It took me forever to figure out Florida was weird, because why would it hit me that it was weird? And maybe y'all had this same experience if you grew up here. I know Craig did. It'd be like asking a fish, "What do you think of that water?" And the fish is like, "What? What's water?" We just live here. And then we start going, "Oh man, why? Why is this like this? You know, why do we do this?" And I think that's where so much of our literature gets started. Why is it like this? And I don't have an ultimate answer. I mean, I just keep saying, "Yeah, it's weird. Move on."
I think it's because we're the end of the line.
Yeah?
And, I think it's because we're at the end of the line, and literally at the end of the line here in Key Weird. This is Florida's the place where it's the last chance for a lot of people, and for a lot of other people, the place to end it all, to enjoy your retirement years. And you come down expecting a certain amount of wonder and beauty and achievement and leisure, and sometimes you get that, and sometimes you don't. And I think that's where the crime writers have come in. And that's why it's so striking. I mean, crime happens in the south side of Chicago, and people say, "Ho hum." Something terrible happens on a beach in Florida, and it's doubly horrible because of the setting where it takes place. And that has a lot to do with people being interested, as I was saying before, in stories, whether they're real or fictional, that are set here.
Please tell these folks about the wonder of Charles Willeford. I think we have to mention him when we talk about weird in Florida.
You had mentioned him, and as I was walking out and glanced at my bookshelf, here's one Charles Willeford book, paperback, and the title is indicative of Charles Willeford's mindset. This one's called "Kiss Your Ass Goodbye." And I got to read you just the opening sentence of this, so you'll appreciate Charles's no-nonsense approach. "I had been running around with Jane Eyre for almost 6 weeks before I found out that she was married. At 10 p.m. Sunday night, when I started to leave my apartment house, planning to buy the early edition of the Monday Morning Miami Herald at the 7-Eleven store a block away, I knew that her husband, Mr. Wright, meant to kill me." And away we go.
And probably his best known book was Miami Blues, right? In which Miami is basically a main character, I would say.
Guy gets off an airplane, you don't know anything about him. He's trying to fight his way through the crowd at the Miami airport, and a Hare Krishna comes up with his peace sign, sticks it in the guy's face, and almost stabs him in the eye. Guy grabs him by the fingers and breaks the two of them. There's a police report. He's finally let go. He goes to his hotel. The next morning, two cops are there. That guy whose fingers you broke, sir, he died in the hospital last night. Off we go.
Yes, off we go.
Played by Alec Baldwin in the movie.
Oh, man.
No one ever played a psychopath better, I would say.
So the Hare Krishnas have been selling lunch on the University of Florida campus since 1972.
I hope they take care of their hands.
Yes.
I wanted to point out that one of my favorite examples and one of my favorite books is Jack Davis's The Gulf, where you would think, how do you tell the story of a body of water? I mean, most of us go and look at it and like, yep, that's the Gulf. And yet here's this big, lush book, the history of something you don't think has a history until you read a book like that. And, what you do in Florida, once you get over palm trees, beaches, paradise, drinks with parasols in, is start to think, what made this place? And what was here before? And what was here before that? I love thinking about that. I never did when I was a kid, because who cares? You're a kid. You go to the beach, it's the beach, right? It's not school. But Jack's book really just changed, I hate to be this nice to you, but it changed the way I thought about how you can write history. You don't have to always have people in it, which is what Jeff Vandermeer was saying, and Lauren Groff, and so many of our writers, which I think is just wonderful. It's a brain reset for us, and it's one I think is vital if we're going to not totally destroy this place.
I think only Jeff can get away with including flying bears, though.
Yeah, it's a bear with an Anglo-Saxon name. It
Yeah.
means death.
That's interesting. You see that I'm writing a book that's a different piece of history that's different for me, because I've always traced the actions of somebody you know about, like Andrew Carnegie or Henry Flagler and his railroad coming down here, and Charles Dickens. But in this case, I'm writing the history of a place, of Coral Gables as a planned city. What about that plan allowed it to blossom in George Merrick's mind long after he died, 80 years ago? Still lives on. How? What about that place, its environment, its social interactions? Very much, a Florida story, and a story not of a person so much as an entity, a physical entity. Maybe it's a group of people, maybe it's an ecology of people, but it's been interesting for me to think about it in that way. Think of the place as a character as opposed to a person.
And an imagined place, because, if y'all been to Coral Gables, the architecture is not what you'd call, what you'd see as native to Florida, but it's native to an idea of Florida. In the same way that, we construct environments in our heads. My family, I promise this is true, owns swampland. Genuine swampland, because we're supposed to buy swampland and it's a scam. We just kind of inherited it because my father's family were poor and that's what they had, a swamp. So the swamp, which I always didn't find interesting, now is the most compelling place to me. I wasn't brought up in it. We'd just go fishing in it because it's mostly water. But, think about that. That swamp, the swamp moves too. Swamps move, rivers move, streams move.
Beaches move.
Beaches move. Sometimes they disappear.
And we have to give Marjorie Stoneman Douglas credit for helping us change our perception of the so-called swamp. And she was arguing against the prevailing views of a waste, equating a swamp with a wasteland, and exploring this very biologically rich place that was essential not only to the wildlife. The Everglades isn't only essential to the wildlife, but she made the argument all of her life since writing that book that it was essential to the human life in South Florida because, and this doesn't get mentioned much, especially when talking about sea level rise in South Florida, is that it's the recharging area for the Biscayne Aquifer, which is regarded as the sole drinking water source for South Florida. And if we don't keep the Everglades healthy, we don't keep the aquifer healthy, we don't keep it full, then it allows for saltwater intrusion. And she recognized all of this back in the 40s. And her father, who was the founder of the newspaper that became the Miami Herald, recognized that the Everglades were responsible for the microclimates of South Florida and the rains, and of course she did too.
This is important to Key West, by the way, because you all know there's no source of fresh water in all the Florida Keys, nor in Key West.
That's right. I was talking to Kerry. What's Kerry's last name? Who was he was your water guy for many years? Yes, Kerry Shelby. And you've got that one water line coming down from the Biscayne Aquifer. And so you guys are equally dependent on a healthy Everglades as those bloated cities on both the east and west coast of South Florida.
Yeah, we used to be told, I was working for the St. Petersburg Times, as it then was at the time, and the 1,000 Friends of Florida, and y'all may be familiar with them, you may be some of them, we're talking about running a water pipeline from North Florida down to South Florida, and I swear everybody came out of the woodwork or the swamp and saying, I'll meet them at the Swanee with a shotgun. They ain't getting our water. They overbuilt, we didn't. You know, it was this, you could see this thing, the idea went away, at least for right now. But the Swanee is a very rich source too. But where my family house, not a swamp, it's over an underground river. And, you know, our subtitle, I think, says something in the water. And until I left home for college, I drank water from that river. It was, we had an artesian well sunk down into it. So, you know, you could say, well, that's her problem. Then it's explained. There's something in that water. But it was amazing to think that we just pulled water for ourselves out of the ground. You know, we got pipes and stuff now. But water is our element. This state is half water anyway, and getting more watery. But that how important that is. And the Everglades and our springs. If you want to see the health of our aquifer, go look in a spring. I mean, the heartbreaking one for me is Wakulla Springs, south of Tallahassee, one of the greatest first magnitude springs in the world. It used to be as clear as gin, and now it isn't. It's murky because of fertilizer runoff from Tallahassee. You know, we've got too many people. We're building too much crap, literally too much crap. And it's muddying the spring, which means it's compromising the aquifer.
Can I be an ass for a minute?
Okay.
And say
Just
that,
for a minute, though.
You know, we've talked just for a minute. My daughter would give me about a half an hour, but no, she wouldn't. She wouldn't even give me a minute. You know, we've talked a lot about the environment. We've trashed Tallahassee, our policymakers and elected officials and so forth. But the responsibility begins with us, and it begins at home. And the best thing that any one of us can do at home is do what Jeff has done. Jeff and Ann have done, what I've done, is rewild. Stop watering your goddamn St. Augustine grass.
And stop with the miracle grow. No miracle grow.
No, oh, absolutely no miracle grow. You stop watering, you're not going to have that runoff. Nearly 50% of the potable water in this state goes down on the ground. And it's not just the farmers. it's us too. We're destroying the estuarine environments around the coast with our green grass, our love of St. Augustine grass. We have a huge grass-growing industry, sod industry in the Everglades that nobody ever talks about. It's as damaging as sugar. And so okay, that was more than
They have
1 minute
big
of being
lobbies.
an ass.
We're getting this frantic signal.
We're getting time for questions.
It's time for questions from you guys. So,
And by the way, people come up and knock on my door all the time, strangers, and say, ask me about my rewilded yard that doesn't have a single blade of grass in it.
I have a question over here.
This isn't really a question, but maybe a point of clarification. When you made reference to the real estate boom in the building industry, how many of you are familiar with an old black and white movie that still may be over in the Key West, Florida history section called Coconuts with the Marx Brothers? That's
you can
where
get
the
any kind of hill
right.
you want. You
started
can even
with a
get
little bit of
stucco.
humor.
I write about it in Margie Stoneman Douglas biography.
Yeah, and I write about it in Florida, too.
Yeah.
The Marx Brothers took on the Florida building boom of the 1920s.
They lost a lot of money in it, too. Or Groucho did.
Yeah, don't mess with the Marx Brothers. They will get you back.
We're that good. There are no more questions.
There's someone in the back, way back
Okay.
there.
Wave frantically.
Oh.
Just thanks for your incredible writing. It is amazing, and the generations of it. But like Mr. King spoke, what about the research you do? I was so fascinated with the details in all of your work, but could you tell us a little bit about your sources of research?
I might just say that when I wrote the first book of nonfiction that I got into back in 2000, it was a lot harder then because nothing was digitized. You had to go to every little library and every big library, and there were no oral histories that had been recorded and digitized. They existed, but you had to go to whatever center held those. And boy, did it take a lot longer than it does these days. Now I can set up and work with one computer screen where I'm typing, where I'm looking at what I'm typing, and the other computer screen where I can go back and research some, double check something. Did I get that right? I have to say, it's remarkably easier. Even so, during the pandemic, there was a lot I would have liked to have done by way of visiting archives. I wrote a book about the circus, and I wanted to go to Baraboo, Wisconsin. I wanted to go to Stamford, Connecticut, where a lot of Barnum paraphernalia was, and just couldn't. So there was a dark day for a lot of historians there. If you couldn't find it online, you were sunk.
Yeah, I did. My research for Dream State was family research, and that's both great and not great in that I come from an extremely laconic family on my mother's side. And I remember asking, some of it was historical research. That was easy. People would give their letters and, they'd just keep saying, you better not make us look bad. I'm like, sure, I won't make you look bad. Give me them letters. But I remember asking my mother how she met my father. And she narrowed her eyes and said, why do you want to know? And I'm like, is it not obvious? I'm here. Otherwise, I wouldn't be. She was very reticent, but I was lucky enough to have one member of the family kept a Civil War diary. This is how low drama these people were. She called it Through Some Eventful Years. And my grandfather, who was so bored with working on his family's turpentine farm, basically, that he ran off to World War I, lied about his age, kept a diary, so many misspelled words. He was 17 years old. And he called that My Trip to France.
We have a question in the small tent to the left.
Hi there. I have a question about when you're writing nonfiction about Florida or any place. It's like a process of discovering facts and stories that in the research part kind of only you know about them often, and then through the process of publishing that book, you're making that history well known to a larger public, and that of course then becomes the story of Florida that people that come afterwards know. And so I kind of want to ask you what's the feeling for you when you do that hard work to find a story that's a secret when you found it, that's this fun piece of history. I'm thinking of stuff in your book, The Gulf, Jack, in particular. And then when it enters into pop culture and sort of everyday people and other novelists or filmmakers just sort of like treat it like it was always part of the fabric of Florida, and they're telling your your research afterwards. Tell me about like that process of taking something from secret to like well known and changing the way people know this place.
Well, when you find something that's new and fresh to yourself and exciting, you're eager to write about it, and I think that that excitement turns into passion that is reflected in your writing, in your storytelling. And I'm sure that my colleagues here are the same way. Every word you put on the page, you're always thinking about your audience. And so if you're excited, you want to excite them. You write it's a very personal experience. You write to discover something about yourself, but also discover something that you can share. Most importantly, share with others, I think. And so when you do stumble across something new and exciting and you get it down in the book and somebody reads it and then comes up to you at a book talk and says, "Oh my gosh, I didn't know about this, fantastic," or "That was my uncle," or something along those lines, then you feel as though that you've accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. That is really the best reward, is these kind of exchanges with your readers.
Let me just mention, I'm working on a book about pythons in Florida, and I actually tracked down the first person to find a python in Florida in 1979. He was coming back from a first date, and was driving on the Tamiami Trail with his date. They were headed to his house, and they had the brights on, and they see this snake lying in the edge of the road. Someone had run over the neck of the snake, but it was still there. And so he slams on brakes, jumps out and runs over and looks at it. It's 11 feet 9 inches long, much longer than any snake should be in the Everglades. And so he grabs the carcass and starts dragging it back to the car. And his date says, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm going to take this back and skin it." And she said, "Not with me in the car, you're not." And he said, "Well, I'll come back for you." And there was no second date. And so I'm using this as research for my book, but I used it I mentioned it in a column that I was writing for the Florida Phoenix, and I have been bombarded with people, documentary filmmakers and so forth, who are trying to contact me to find out more about the guy who found the first python, because they think it's part of their story to tell too. And so that's sort of, but it's that, you're right, it's that absolute thrill of, I found the guy who with the first python, and this is great, and this is awesome, and it's a wonderful story. And Florida has so many of those moments.
You go ahead.
I was just going to say that when I was in school, history was presented to me largely as a compendium of dates and names to be memorized and then forgotten the moment the test was over. And I still have a vague sense that as years go, 1066 is a lot more important than 1067 or 1065. But I'm not real clear on why. And if you told me, I'd probably forget by the time I got to the parking lot. But when I started to write Last Train to Paradise, I did this mountainous of research, and I found out everything I could and talked to everybody that was still alive, and on and on and on. And I began to write that 3 or 4 times, and each time I discovered that I was boring myself to death. I was writing the world's longest encyclopedia article. And I knew that if I was boring myself, what was I going to be doing to my readers? And I had written before that time 8 novels, and I said, what are you going to do with all this stuff, Les? And I said, well, you know how to tell a story. Tell this story. One of the richest men in the world undertakes the engineering challenge of the century, and the worst hurricane in history blows it all away. That would seem better than anything I could even dream up. And so if there's anything to be found that's new within the covers of that book, I think it has to do with the story and the creation of character, not so much to do with who drove what spike at what mile marker on the way down the Keys. That's what I'm always focused in on, to answer your question.
We have another question over here. Hi, I'm a recovering journalist, so I'm going to start with a point of clarification for Ms. Roberts. There have been 2 accounts in the news of gators being discovered in hotel rooms in the last few months in this lovely state.
Were they raiding the minibar, though? That's the key question.
They did not include that information in the story, but you know with gators, right? But I loved this morning, for those of us who were here, the author who mentioned that gators are like the deer of Florida. So I did a little research. There's about 1,000 people who die from hunting accidents related to deer, and then another 440 who die from car accidents related to deer. But in Florida, it's about 2 per year die from alligators. That's statistically significantly less. So my question for you, dear authors, is how are you going to help revamp the reputation of this wonderful state by, because I certainly am one of those Yankees that thought Floridians don't read. And I moved to Fort Myers and discovered this seminar, and I'm like, oh my God, this state is much more diverse and interesting than I previously thought. So I know you guys make a lot of money writing stories about weird Florida, but well, okay, a lot of money for a writer, okay, I'll clarify. But you guys have any stories in the works to sort of present this as it's normal and it's okay, because it's actually not as scary, weird, or dangerous. And maybe people here do read and aren't all backwoods rednecks or crazy drug, Miami Vice type people. So, yeah.
I have to tell you, when I go around and talk about my books, and especially my book, Oh, Florida, How America's Weirdest State Influences the Rest of the Country, people come up to me afterwards and they feel compelled to tell me their Florida stories. And some of them are just about as weird as you can get. And my favorite one is the one about the couple who discovered quite by accident that their new next-door neighbors were running an illegal nudist bed and breakfast. And the way they found out is they bought their kids a trampoline for Christmas.
I think that Floridians, I know we have a reputation, and a deserved reputation, especially right now, for being a bunch of backward book banning weirdos. And we're not all that. In fact, most of us are not that. I think we do read. I live in what I like to think of, despite it being the home of state government, as a pocket of resistance. For us in Tallahassee, when the legislature comes to town, we refer to the place as occupied Tallahassee. They are not us. We are,
They're not Florida.
They're not Florida. Boy, are they not. We're gerrymandered to a fare thee well in this state. But we resist. Tallahassee has 2.5 universities. We kind of make people know that we care about the culture, strange culture, beautiful culture, stupid culture, smart culture. Yeah, boy, we have rednecks. I'm kin to many, 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 many of them. Climate denying people who are watching their beaches erode, and they're like, well, I can't help it. And that's how we really talk up north.
If you want to know more about gators, stick around for Rebecca Renner's
Yes.
and her fabulous book, Gator Country. There's also another book coming out on the history of alligators, cultural and natural history of alligators, a little different from Rebecca's. That was written, or is being written, by a Florida native who's now a historian in Virginia, or West Virginia, excuse me. But there's new material coming out on gators.
It's not just alligators. My grown son, my adult son, lives with the fear every day that he's going to be hit by a falling coconut and killed.
Where does he live?
In Miami.
He's more likely to be hit by a falling iguana.
I went online and and to date there is no recorded instance of anyone ever having died from a falling coconut in the entire state of Florida over all time. But that doesn't matter.
The iguanas, there are documented cases of iguanas falling, and specifically, there was one last year where one fell into the middle of a yoga class in Miami and hit a guy, and he said it hit him, it felt like a sandbag, just hit, it was like a 40-pounder, because it was fighting another iguana in the trees and lost its, well, I don't know if it gets footing, clawing, well, I'm not sure what the proper term is. Anyway, and of course the other problem with iguanas is they pop up in your toilet, but that's a different, different kind of injury entirely.
We do have, I believe, still the highest rate of death from lightning strikes.
Yes.
Yes.
And poisonous snake bites. And
And shark bites.
And shark
We're the
bites.
shark bite capital of the world.
I keep trying to tell people this so they'll stop moving here. It's just like, oh boy, it's dangerous, man.
Well, I mean, Florida is trying to kill us. It's trying its very best to kill us.
It's always trying to kill us.
Considering what we do to Florida, can you blame it?
Nope.
That's all the time we have for questions.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Be careful. Always look up.
And down.